You think right here?
Yeah, how far can we get away with angling it away from Sarah?
It's a little weird now. Yeah. There. I mean, yeah.
I think that's all right.
Here, sit here and see what you think.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's totally viewable.
But if I angle it,
Yeah, it's a little, well, yeah, right there. I think. What? I mean, someone from way over here is not going to be able to see it. Is that?
not really.
Yeah, but they can still see it. I can see it.
And they can turn.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think this is good.
All right, let's get everybody in here.
What's the matter?
Still smooth out by itself.
Even with the rocket switch disabled?
Yeah. As much as, yeah.
What is even going on then?
Yeah, because that's.
The rocket switch does nothing.
No, I mean, it shouldn't. I didn't fully disable it. I just clicked as many things off I could with rocket.
So it's not good.
Does it do anything now?
Now I feel like I'm hallucinating. It's moving, but maybe it's not. I think it looks fine.
Yeah. Let's try it with it. That will stick.
Yeah.
So put it.
That one set to 124 or 148. You can get it to 124. Yeah, just so that.
You're gonna be on the wireless.
Okay. But I just leave it on, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't seem like.
Where's that stool, Kurt?
Where do you think would be the best place to put the computer? Maybe to the left a little bit, or?
It's okay. It wasn't a problem.
No, it looks good.
I don't think I've met either of you yet. I'm Brody.
Mine's on Saturday. Is yours later today? Yeah. Oh, great. Cool. Oh, man. hearing the barbershop space.
Mine is definitions of love.
Oh, good. Cool.
It's in our blog as well.
The family is love.
Where you go from?
I'm coming from
Brooklyn.
they're from Philadelphia.
Yeah. I'm from LA.
Oh, okay. I'm from Dublin.
Okay, cool. Okay.
I'm coming from just kind of north of Joshua Tree.
Oh, nice.
But I'm
Oh,
in Canada.
someone was telling me, are you the one who's like fixing up a
Oh yeah, I just finished rebuilding a
Oh, cool.
cabin up there. Yeah.
That's neat. I'm Roderick. Do you have a, is there someplace this afternoon? Oh, great. Awesome. I'm excited for that. This is a shorts program that at least their films are in a shorts program that I won today.
Almost.
I've got a feature that screens on a sad competition. It's called Manscaping.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where are you based? New York. I live in LA. Well, I mean, I've been there for a long time now, so it's kind of by default just become home. Yeah. Just my friend and I just made it back to New York fix for the first time since 2019.
I believe they're on their way. Yeah. We wait a couple minutes and then start without. Does it take too long? Oh, Eileen, you're in the wrong spot, really. But I think we need one more chair then. Sorry.
We need one more chair?
Yeah. Don't have to run. It's there and I'll just send mine over.
Oh, okay. Okay. Oh, yeah. How does it work with audio? Oh, okay. Okay.
You mean like in the city or in the oh, okay.
I wanted to go.
Another chair coming?
Yeah, Larry, today.
Oh, thank you.
Wear it that way.
No.
Yeah, they texted like maybe 10 minutes ago, so I'm expecting them to arrive at 10 minutes ago. So it's not there.
Let me know when you want.
Well, I don't know, I mean, we could, yeah. Maybe-
Did everybody sleep all right?
Yeah.
You know, here? Did anybody have stars? Did you see this? Did somebody, you do it?
Well, my son's dark stars.
You put them up in a like a pattern or
I try to do like a Nokia kind of thing.
another shape? Are they large? Are they
All
small?
sizes, yeah.
You know, there's some really small ones you can get. In my childhood, I had them in my room, but apparently they were toxic. You know, I don't know where I want to go with that. Yesterday, stars and see there.
Or if they like fell into your mouth.
They fell into my mouth, but it would be that, you know, thinking about the toxic Milky Way. I don't think I ever put them on. I was given them as a present. But now they're bigger ones. Like they're bigger.
We're coming up on 10:10.
All right, well, maybe we can just start and then we can pop up on six. So we can.
Hello? Kim and John, can you hear me? Okay, great. Hi. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for your patience. We're still actually waiting, or well, we're not going to wait. We'll just get started, but we're missing one person who is hopefully on the way. But maybe we'll just get started with introductions, and maybe they'll arrive by the time we reach the empty chair. These conversations are just meant to be like an opportunity for you all to talk to each other about your projects, about your practice. Anyone out there who wants to join in too, please don't be shy. Ask questions, make comments. I know that a lot of you have yet to see each other's work, so we also sort of hope that these conversations maybe spark curiosity about each other's projects, and we hope that you'll go check out the programs that a lot of you are in the same couple programs, so which are coming up soon. And so this conversation we've called Who Are You and Whom Do You Love? And that is actually sort of a direct reference to Ama's piece in the festival, which is itself inspired by The Vertical Interrogation of Strangers, a work of prose poetry by Banu Kapil Ryder. And that is, I think, from the 1990s, maybe. You're probably much more of an expert on it than I am. But as she travels between India and England and the US, sort of exploring her own experience of Indian diaspora and what it means to be an Indian woman in the world. And so she sort of structures that work on these 12 questions that she asks women everywhere. And one of those questions like, who are you and whom do you love? So that's the sort of general framework. We're thinking about folks who work sort of with family, friends, and partners, or like very personal topics like identity. And that's the general framework for the conversation, or for themes that maybe we can pull out from your work, but we don't have to feel super restricted by that. So since y'all haven't really seen each other's work yet, or not in the festival anyway, maybe we could just do some quick, brief synopses, or just describe what your project is in the festival, and who you are. And maybe we'll start with the folks beaming in virtually. Kim, do you want to go first, please?
Sure. Hi. Thanks for inviting me to be here. My name is Kim Mcdaniel, and my film in the program is called A Story That Doesn't Have to Do With Me. And it started actually because I wanted to make a film about pleasure, because I had just finished a series of films about trauma recovery and disability. And I was kind of looking for like a break. And I was like, I'm going to make this, my next film is going to be about pleasure. And then it ended up being about death. So I don't know. But yeah, it was, I made it with my partner, who's an archaeologist, and wanting to get to know what they do better, and getting them to kind of open up a little bit more and share what they do and their research and their work with me, and realizing how many connections there were. So they study like the bones of children, and also kind of relate that back to feminist and queer theory, and how history has informed gender, specifically in relationship to burial. And so yeah, I started realizing that my partner, their research is really rooted in the physical, in the bones, and in bodies, and that as much as I related to body through disability and trauma work, I also was really interested in the spiritual realm of the body and death. And so the film kind of explores that tension between us. Thanks.
John? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm John Haley, coming to you from Alabama. And my film is Last Race, which is a short observational documentary that really started as kind of an effort to examine all of the factors shaping political campaigns and electoral efforts in 2020 through the lens of one campaign for a state assembly office in Wisconsin. And that's how it started out, kind of looking at how all of this unprecedented election year, I know that word unprecedented has been thrown around so many times for the moment in 2020, but looking at how it was affecting one person and one campaign. But somewhat similarly, I guess, to what Kim said about stories changing as we make them, it became much more of a personal story about finding love in the midst of all of this. And so it's sort of this purely observational documentary where, one story kind of rises slowly to become an equal to the other thread that ties the story together.
Thank you. Maybe then we'll go to the other end.
Hi, my name is Zebulon Zhang, and my film is Tomorrow's a Long Way Off. It's a documentary that I had shot initially the footage for about 7 years ago, and it had kind of lain dormant in a drive for a while, and there was a sort of massive issue that occurred with it. The documentary itself is about a road trip with my father up to the Arctic Circle to see the first day of 24 hours of sunlight that occurs there on June 21st. This is kind of like a dream that he had to go on this trip since he was a very young child. And in trying to shoot it, there became this kind of problem with the audio that then forced me to go through and kind of rework the entire concept of the project. But this idea of memory and trying to kind of rework through these kind of forgotten experiences ended up becoming the core of the actual focus itself of the film. So thank you.
Hi, my name is Tiff Reckham. My film is also a father film. It's called Declarations of Love. It's a hybrid documentary fiction that I made with and about my dad over the course of almost 3 years. And it is, in a nutshell, a return of his gaze 2 decades later. He used to film my sisters and I with home video when we were younger. So it is looking back at him and his body and our house and the landscape.
Hi, I'm Broderick Fox. The film that I have in the festival is called Manscaping, and it kind of looks at 3 queer men who are reimagining the traditional barbershop space and kind of trying to think about it as a more inclusive space, and through that kind of expand conceptions of masculinity. And I guess my work, I'm so curious to hear about these other films. I started off making autobiographical work, then sort of moved out to making a work with one central character through whom I was able to access a community. And now this film is the first time I've really kind of woven a number of different lives other than my own. I guess the common thread across them are sort of trying to amplify and center sort of queer perspectives and queer stories.
Hi, my name is Alma. My film's called Convergence, and Sarah did a great job of breaking down the vertical interrogation of strangers, which is the book that's kind of the intellectual foundation of the film. And I heard about the book maybe 5 years ago when I was writing my thesis in my undergrad years, and I just loved the questions and I held on to them. And last year I decided to do something with them, and so I sat down with participants, and it was this really beautiful, intuitive process. I didn't really even think that it would be a documentary, nor did I think it would be experimental in the way that it is, but I ended up adding a dance portion, and what came of it are these really beautiful 4 chapters, flowers, grounded, past, and future. And so I sort of split up the questions into those sections, and each has its own theme and vibe, but all fall under the umbrella, I guess, of vulnerability and connection. And, you know, we were coming out of a pandemic, and I really wanted to understand how people were conceptualizing their lives after this big, you know, event that is still happening, but we were over the bulk of it. And yeah, it turned out to be fantastic. So I'm happy.
Okay. I'm Eileen Rosina. My film in the festival is called Seed Summer Tomb. It is about it's more or less a tribute to my grandmother, who passed in 2020. And the film is about maternal cycles, thresholds of consciousness. She died in December, and just a couple days later, I found out I was pregnant with my first child, and that timing needed some exploration. And I don't know, what happens to a spirit after someone passes, but I wanted to explore this idea of energy just not dissipating, but transferring form. And I also mine my personal family archives in the film. My dad was an avid home video maker, and there's many hundreds of hours looking through. So this film is based on an interview I did with my grandma, in April prior to her death. And we just so happened to talk about pregnancy the whole time and babies. And like, it was just, it had to be explored. And the film's title is from a poem by Emily Dickinson called A Pit But Heaven Over It. And the poem ends with the phrase, "Seed summer tomb, whose doom to whom?" Kind of asking when someone dies, like whose doom is it? Is it the people that are remaining or the person that has passed? So yeah, very excited to be here. Thanks.
Sure. Sorry to be late. I'm still arriving. So those of you are welcome to take a breath with me. My film is also a dedication to my grandmother. So I'm Xiao Lu, and the film is called "I Wish You Happy Moon Festival," and in Mandarin is 祝你中秋快乐. And I think this film is a situation like I didn't have like intentions of making this. Is just more of a it was a habit of keeping the archive of my conversation with my grandpa, because my grandma also like couldn't really come to the phone. So it's a lot of just like this barrier of communication, and a lot of the intensity of like miscommunication, and it's just like this you'll see like there's a lot of like repetition that happens in the film. It's just like really like a desire trying to relay a message, but we're just like just from distance, but also from my grandpa is hard of hearing, so there's a lot of barriers for us to actually even communicate. And I actually don't really recall ever having a just a more in-depth conversation with him, like since I moved away. So it's a lot of layers. Yo, okay. Yeah, so just a lot of it, layers of communication and care, and also like giving some presence to the absence of my grandmother. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I think communication is really present, like as a sort of like topic in a lot of these works. So maybe, and also like continuing to think about like the vertical interrogation of strangers, like this idea of using the word interrogation instead of interview, I think is really interesting, like that choice. So maybe if you each kind of want to like address your choices of communicating with your subjects, like some of you are doing these, formally structured interviews. Some of you are doing these like more informal conversations, or pulling from conversations that you've recorded or from archives. So maybe just if you want to talk about like how that formulated for your project, like whether you're working observationally and have chosen to not sort of include any like direct interview, or if you are, what led you to the choice that you've made. And we can start with virtual folks again. I think that makes sense. Kim, do you want to go first again?
Yeah, so I was inspired because I was talking with a mentor about what I was going to do after I had like finished the series that I'd been working on, and I was telling her how I felt a little lost actually, like I didn't know how to get started since I'd been really immersed in the what I'd been doing before, and she kind of encouraged me to she kind of shared from her own life. She was like, you know, when I felt really down in my own life, I pretended like I wasn't me, and I pretended like I had this amazing childhood where I was loved deeply, and that and I pretended as though that was who I was, and it changed my life. I pretended like that for a whole year, that I was deeply loved my whole childhood, and it changed my life. And so I started really thinking, and I really like the idea of thinking about making a film like that, because I kind of felt like a narcissist because I had just spent like making 6 films all about me. And I was kind of like, you know, like, yeah, I was wanting to like do something more collaborative. And yeah, I think, you know, what I found out was like, yeah, even when I'm thinking that it's not about me, it always is about me when my research is personal. And so yeah, I think that that's where like the genesis of wanting to talk and get to know my partner, and I had just started the relationship kind of, and was really curious about them, and just decided to kind of like very informally, if we were laying in bed together, or yeah, just really casually, you know, just to be like, can I record this, you know, and started just with saying like, can you just like tell me a story from an archive that you know, where you're not like betraying anybody's identity from the history, or you know, from your research, but you know, what's a story that you have that really stuck with you. And one of the first stories that they told me made it into the film, about a woman who threw her baby over a bridge in Milwaukee because either the baby was born dead or she couldn't care for it. And it really, and really the story was about how somebody saw her do it and called her queer. They thought that it was a queer thing to do, because you know, as language changes, you know, back then in the 19th century, like queer just meant like that was weird, you know. So yeah, as like a queer person, I really started thinking about like, yeah, how my partner and I both relate to being queer, and how I've related to being queer, and like it took, yeah, I guess if I recenter myself here, like it took a lot actually to get things out of my partner. Like it, like when you mentioned interrogation, I was definitely like, yes, that was my process. Like it was couched in like, oh, like, can I casually record this? But it was also, as soon as I turned the recorder on, my partner got like academic, and I'm like, okay, like we're naked in bed, like you don't have to be academic, like you can just be casual. But yeah, like I was coming up against like, for me being vulnerable was my practice, but for them the vulnerability was very separate from their research. And like it was, I felt like what I wanted for the film, and like where I would, you know, what I wanted together was for us to like build this foundation of vulnerability in our relationship, and then to use the film kind of as an excuse to do that. And it was really, really hard. They told me they regret being so resistant. I was like, thank you for apologizing.
I do really like the way they push back, like, and that you include that, right? Like at some point you ask sort of a leading question. I can't remember exactly, but like, you know, oh, what you do is all about this, and they like totally push back against that. So I like that you're like, you know, willing to include that that tension that you just described is definitely present in the way you edit it, or what you left in your edit.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah. I felt like I wanted to like reveal myself. Like, yeah, I definitely had assumptions about what they did that like weren't fair. And I wanted to be like, they're making themselves vulnerable. And for me, being vulnerable is being wrong. And I was wrong a lot, like throughout the process.
Thanks, Kim. John?
Yeah. I mean, I think of conversation and communication in a couple different ways with my project where, I mean, one big component of that was kind of a logistical and ethical concern was just that the story I set out to tell changed. And so how to communicate that to someone who signed on for one project, and then, you know, how to have that conversation of if Emily was, you know, okay with the project changing to, you know, a more personal aspect of her story. So that conversation about what's okay to be filmed and what's okay to be included was an important one to have kind of early on as the story started shifting a bit. But I primarily, I think we, you know, developed, because of those conversations up front, developed a pretty strong friendship and strong relationship. And eventually the film kind of took on, I envisioned it as, you know, this perhaps interview driven approach that would incorporate archival footage or footage that kind of situates us in this moment. And it became just all these primarily observational moments with a couple of Emily speaking to me or speaking to the camera, which I think maybe indicates something of that relationship that we formed. But a bigger part too was also finding a way for all of these, once the piece shifted to be primarily observational, finding a way for all these moments to communicate with each other, and for conversation to be had among these scenes as well. And so finding sounds or images that tie different moments together was a big part of that too. So yeah, I think the big thing was just kind of that honest communication that maybe this started out as a purely political film, filtered through one campaign, and then it shifted to something more personal, or all these moments that I filmed started to take on this more personal tone. And so communicating and having a conversation about, if the film shifts more in this direction, is that something that's okay with you? Is that something that isn't too personal, I guess?
Yeah, I was really curious about that, how that like adjustment happened, or at what point that adjustment, like for you and for Emily, I guess, happened. But it sounds like it was pretty early on, or pretty much during production, at least, not post-production. But I was also curious, so you did not know Emily before you started the project?
So we had, so I'm from Minnesota, she's from Wisconsin. We had connected on Facebook about some other project I had been working on. And I asked to use some footage she had posted, and we just kind of started messaging back and forth about, I guess, Midwestern political frustrations. But no, before filming, we had kind of only had that relationship, and the conversation too about her kind of new relationship happened early on in the process. I think our second day of filming, where she, you know, just spoke about that, and you know, I'm gay as well, and so there was something that could actually kind of become a connection between us, something that we could share in some ways, not everything, but little, you know, parts of that in that process. And she had this, you know, process of navigating whether or not to come out on the campaign trail, which she eventually did. But yeah, it kind of just, we hit it off pretty quickly once we connected in person.
Thank you. Zeb will do the same route.
Sounds good. I mean, I think in sort of a different space than what was previously mentioned, is like working with someone like your father, who you already have a sort of, like, you know, a very long-standing relationship with, allows for. I appreciated like to interrogate someone rather than just have a conversation. That I felt like there was, because of that basis, the potential for an actual kind of antagonism at times with the interrogation, and an attempt to be able to try and push a discussion potentially to places where people are less willing to go, but they're willing to go because because there is like a basis of love and trust in that. And so I felt like that was a big component for myself, wherein my father's never really had any interest in the film itself or in any of the other films I've ever produced. He's never seen the film. He's never really seen much of my work. And so for him, this was kind of like, once again, an oddity, but an oddity that got to have value because he was kind of pushed into having to have these real discussions that if the camera wasn't present or if the project wasn't occurring, might never have actually been able to be spoken about. And so I think that there was this capacity wherein maybe similar to what was previously mentioned, is that the process of the filmmaking deepened the relationship or changed the relationship through this kind of more difficult series of questions that were able to be asked. And that to me was kind of an interesting place to go, because I don't think I have a naturally antagonistic relationship with most of my film subjects. You're not trying to push them away, but in this case, it was something that could kind of grow both of us throughout the process. So that was a very important component for me, and kind of why I appreciate the phrasing of it. So thank you.
I made one film with my dad before this one. And in it, I tried to talk to him, to verbally engage with him, and a little bit in this one too, interviews and conversation. And I found that I don't trust, I didn't trust anything that he was saying about his life. I in just like you were saying, when you have a relationship with a family member, it's longstanding. He's had a longstanding relationship with his own life, and I think has narrativized it to himself in a lot of ways. And I just wasn't interested in that. I didn't find it. I mean, I think it was interesting to hear it, through the lens of, okay, this is how he has decided to describe his life for me. But in terms of finding a truth in a film, I just didn't think it was honest. So I don't really communicate with him verbally in the film at all, but I kind of shifted my focus to, like I said, returning his gaze years later. And when I saw those home videos for the first time, which in part kind of catalyzed my desire to start filming with him, I thought this shared language of cinema and of filming was a much more apt and appropriate way to try to communicate with him. And there was, we have a pretty fraught relationship, and he has a lot of rage, and there was something really disturbing about, the way he filmed us. And, as young little people, you have no agency, in terms of deciding whether you want to be filmed or not, but also in life, in the against the tide of like growing up and being raised and what you're exposed to. And I wanted to turn the camera back onto him. And and I think, and I'm extremely thankful. I mean, the film's called Declarations of Love. So I don't think he also didn't have like an interest really in the film, but he was giving his presence and his body, back to me, because he wanted me to make something good, a good film. And I'm extremely, grateful for that. And kind of the way that I started to communicate with him throughout the process was through little gifts, gift giving. And that's kind of where the fiction lies too in my film. So whether it's the presentation of an animal, a tortoise, a frog, for him to encounter. So it becomes more of him encountering me as a director, and I found protection in that as well. So
That's really interesting that you did. So you had not seen any of that footage that he had shot of you, like as when you're really young. You didn't see that footage until more recently as an adult.
right,
Okay.
yeah, at least that I can remember.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I saw it for the first time a few years ago, it was extremely violent experience, and still is for me.
Thanks, Tiff. Brody?
Gosh, it's so interesting to hear these responses. I mean, the film that I have in the festival, Manscaping, is not autobiographical, but I'm resonating with anybody here talking about filming with family. I think having done that in the past, I think some of those were some of the scariest and sort of most complex sort of experiences I've had. They kind of refract and distill all the kind of larger professional questions of sort of informed consent and communication into some really kind of like concentrated and complex ways. So this film, Manscaping, I had a conceptual idea that I wanted to look at sort of beards, barbering, and body hair as sites of sort of play and exploration in the queer community, and wanted to intentionally reach out to individuals who, through their art practice or through their professional lives or through their daily sort of presentation of self, are intentionally kind of confounding notions of gender binary, et cetera. And, that entailed actually just starting to Google people. And so in some ways, this was sort of a unique project to me in the sense that the first time I was actually meeting people in person was when I was going to film with them. And the correspondence before then had been largely via email. I mean, I guess one of the benefits of having made kind of autobiographical work that doesn't pull any punches and shows me and sort of all of my complexities is that I was actually able to share that work with participants in advance. And so I think they were able to get a sense of, probably more than they ever wanted to know, of like who I was, but also kind of get a sense about perhaps how I manage or navigate, or like to think I try to manage or navigate sort of complex personal and sort of intimate and vulnerable situations with some degree of sort of sensitivity and one hopes or aspires to artistry in some fashion. And so I actually had one of the participants recently say to me that was sort of like the check, in a way, kind of seeing work that I made. So particularly the three individuals who are in the piece, though we may perhaps all kind of identify under this umbrella of queer, that's a very heterogeneous sort of cohort. Amongst that group, there's an individual who sort of is very aligned, doesn't sort of identify really in terms of any sort of label of gay, though I think from the outside he talks about people sort of by default would sort of describe himself as a gay male who's involved in a fetish community, another individual who's a Black American queer artist, and then a transgender Canadian barber. And so as somebody who is sort of not trans or Black myself, even though we're sort of under this sort of umbrella of common queerness, there's obviously some very distinct sort of aspects of our identity that I don't profess to know or be an authority in representing. And so it definitely has been a kind of really interesting and important navigation to sort of figure out ways in which you find points of commonality and communication, but also sort of figure out that sort of challenge of representing others and doing that justice. This is also one of the first projects where I've taken, as I mentioned, 3 stories and woven them together. And even though I'm not in the film, I think innately every documentary in some way is autobiographical, in the sense that any active representation is therefore sort of one that's filtered through one's subjectivity. And so even the ways in which I selected these 3 individuals, and even how I cut between them and transition between aspects of their lives, kind of was sort of, this may seem obvious, but actually sitting in the editing chair was kind of mind-blowing at certain points, of like the onus of I'm creating these connections and comparisons across individuals' lives who've never actually met or encountered one another. And there's something kind of there's a real responsibility in that, which is interesting.
And I also assume, and I think maybe I read this somewhere in your writing about the work, that like the idea of using barbering or body hair came from your own like discomfort with those spaces, right? So I think that's an important like point of connection, and for these three people who, like you said, have never met, but they've all met you, and that's like a constellation out from out from your own sort of personal experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. So, all four of us in some way are kind of thinking about the barbershop space or trying to reimagine the barbershop space as a result of a sense of kind of push-pull in relationship to that space. And sort of, even though it may seem like a very niche and strange space to choose, I think some of those push-pulls by extension can be extrapolated out into kind of other social spaces or small businesses, et cetera.
Thanks.
So regarding conversation, communication, it was definitely like, it wasn't a conversation. My film was definitely an interview, and I hope it didn't feel like an interrogation, but I understand why Banu chose that word, because it can feel that way when there's just 3 cameras in your face. And a lot of my participants, well, all of them are, they don't work in the arts per se. And they all came to me in various ways. I was living in LA at the time, and I moved there right before the pandemic. So I kind of didn't know many people. But like one of the little girls in my film is my little cousin versus Jazz, who is a friend of a friend that I met on the day of filming. So there were varying degrees of like familiarity with all the subjects. I think as the filmmaker, it was a weird experience because I was asking people such vulnerable questions. Like, they would be crying and then I would be crying, but like I specifically structured it so that like you wouldn't know that I was asking the question. So I would tell them to talk to the camera, don't talk to me, but like they would end up talking to me anyway because I'm the person standing in front of them. And then I would be like reacting to them and like crying and like having to control myself, or people would tell funny stories and I would start to laugh and be like, no, like you can't catch my audio, like things like that. So it was definitely, it was a strange experience to like be asking people these vulnerable questions, but like not actually able to engage with them as I'm asking them. But I also interviewed myself. So I think, speaking to the responsibility of being a filmmaker, I felt like if I was asking people to come and share these things with me on camera, that I sort of had the responsibility to do the same myself, to sort of like level the playing field, so to speak. Because in this film, like I had a lot of power. People basically signed away like their image to me. And I didn't show any of the participants any of the cuts before I finished the film. So I felt like, yeah, to level the playing field and sort of even out the power dynamics, like interviewing myself and putting myself in that vulnerable space was necessary. But yeah, I think the way it all turned out, I specifically wanted to focus on how we all connect, even if we don't know each other. And I think the way the film is structured sort of mimics that, in that the participants didn't film together. Nobody knew what anybody else was going to say. But when it's all cut together, you can kind of see the different themes. You can see the similarities and the differences. But there's definitely a connective thread throughout all of the interviews that I hope comes through in the film.
If it works.
Thank you. All right. I also felt an enormous amount of responsibility making a tribute to someone. My grandma didn't get a say in how she's portrayed in this film, and this is a lasting piece of moving image work that a lot of people will see. And so I didn't take that lightly. The conversation that we had was very casual, although my grandma did tend to ham it up a little bit when I turned the recorder on. She was a great storyteller and just kind of got a little flowery and exaggerated in her language when we were recording. But I did leave a lot of those natural pauses in the film and these kind of like mundane moments that weren't related to the interview. I left that in the film just because they're kind of charming. And communicating with her was so easy, and there's so much love. And I continued that conversation, I felt, with mining the archives, after her death, and looking back from when I was a baby to and all of the clips of her and I that I could find. And really thinking about, how someone lives on through this kind of record as well. I realized that a lot of what I thought were my memories were maybe just home videos that I had watched over and over again. And this kind of idea of how our memories are formed, through watching these things, what is real, what is true. And I did learn a lot about my family through watching these things that I maybe didn't know or that had been skewed. And yeah, it was a really fascinating investigation into that. And it took me a really long time to listen to our conversation after she died. I felt like it was going to be really traumatic, but it wasn't. I finally played it. It was like an hour-long record, and I just laughed out loud. It was like I had hung out with her, and so she lives on. Like in my memory too. It's not like she's gone. Physically, yes, but like she's carried forward in numerous ways. So that's lovely.
Yeah, I mean, this film is like, okay, I think I was like, after making this, I was like kind of understanding, a lot of my practice actually start from sound. And like also what Max was talking about yesterday about gathering, as a gatherer for materials. I very much, like, I don't know what I would use any of this for, but I'm, yeah, like being a facilitator or like gathering these things, and this conversation just happened, like it was a practice for me, just any chance I get, also because of the limitation of like video calls. I can't really record sound, and like I have to call through like a third party app to record. Yeah. But like I wanted to like find, just like work with something from this, and then this was like a clip that I identify, like, and also remembering the moment, the context of having this conversation with him. Yeah, like I don't know how, and also like even just the conversation, like understanding of filmmaking. I don't think my grandparents know really what I do. I've attempted to try to explain, but then also it's like that maybe it's not very necessary. And there are just like parts of ourselves that we probably don't ever like revealed or like really resolve. And like, and then for me too is like being curious about a lot of parts of their life, but there are a lot of limitations in what like access is. And the film, it doesn't really have much imagery of like with my grandfather. It was more these like video sketches I was taking just during pandemic, and it was sort of a intuitive process to like put the audio and the imagery together. But the sound was really, I think, the heart. Oh yeah, and another thing about communication is like I really love this quote. I think Kiarostami said this in like one of his interviews about how misunderstandings is like the foundation behind love, not the other way around. I really feel that just with my relationship with family, anybody on this planet, like that. Yeah, it's like accepting. I think it's a continued practice for me to accept there isn't understanding, but with the misunderstanding, that's how we're still entangled and still want to care for each other. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking about the image and sound relationships in a lot of your projects, and also like back to vertical interrogation of strangers, I guess, the sort of like way through like fragmentation, or like, it's prose poetry that takes like bits from all of these people's answers and combines them with her own personal experience in like a fragmentary or more lyrical way, and thinking about documentary as we often know it in the mainstream as being like a very didactic or like, discursive based thing, but a lot of you are like sort of attempting to do something else, right? And maybe the way she was too, through her own like she's got this interview structure, but then she's really like using that as a starting place, right? So maybe just thinking about your image and sound relationships, like Eileen, I was thinking about a lot of your images and how maybe you thought to combine them with your, like the interview with your grandmother, like you have the melting ice cubes and like shadows moving across the floor in time lapse and stuff like that. And I don't know, there's like a distancing there that I think I'm just interested, maybe if anyone, I'll throw it to you first, but then if anyone else wants to maybe think about answering that for your own projects too.
Yeah, I did use a lot of time lapse and thinking about, I don't know, collapsing time, traversing time, like digging back into the archives and pulling it forward. I tried to line up some key moments with my grandma's interview and words, and then just allows for some space as well. Especially, I feel like this is at the end of the film, kind of ends with this break open where, in a very grandmotherly way, she's like, get married. Like the only thing you need to do like in your life is get married. And like, she tells me all the steps to do that. And then the film ends with where I got married. We ended up eloping, thank you, COVID, to this bat cave. Yes, that's true. But it's also like a release of life, and people have thought that it's like, like when a soul dies, like birds fly or bats fly, and but the sound that I included was just my breath and my reactions, and it's very raw. And I thought about using like music, but then I ended up leaving it in, and just being okay with that. I think that's my answer. Anyone else want to take a step?
Well, I think in terms of the connection to image and sound, music actually was probably one of the bigger decisions, because other than that, it's just the audio of the participants speaking. But for the dance portions, I really wanted it to be, I wanted to have a score. And that involved me really sitting down and thinking about like the energy of each chapter. It was really like a moment of translation, and also very personal, because I felt like the music was kind of a primer for each chapter, because it happens at the beginning. And it's at the beginning and the end of each chapter, and it primes like the transition between the chapters. So thinking about like I would have to like talk to my composer and be like, okay, like this is how I think this chapter feels. And now we have to find instruments that feel that way. And like that process it was very intuitive, but also I discovered a lot. I feel like I learned a lot of new words about how to describe music. But yeah, that process of translation was something that I didn't expect from the film. And it was sort of separate from like the interview process. Like there was the chopping of the interviews themselves, and then there was the chopping of the dances. And then at the end, like the score really became its own process that really tied everything together.
Yeah, I mean, for my project, I feel like the sound and image relationship are kind of the key to the entire work in some ways, because what I mentioned earlier, all of the sound was corrupted on all of my footage, and so the entire film, the soundtrack for the entire film is recorded about 5 years later. And so the kind of soundscape of the entire film is almost like a secondary documentary that's overlaid on top. And so this was kind of this very, and I think that's where the tension arises, is in these attempts to try and rebuild a reality, and the sort of inherent failure in trying to rebuild and meld those two realities together, the sound and the image, and just having to kind of come to terms with really the power of the sound itself to direct a lot of the attention and to kind of build the world out in a significant way. And when every single piece of it has to be by your decision, it ends up, as much as maybe it fades away when you rewatch it, but it becomes this kind of like a very funny attempt at like reenacting the entirety of a series of events, which you're having to deal with on these two levels. So yeah, I think the image sound relationship was kind of the crux to the entire work for me. So that was a big point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's the first time where you're explaining that in the film, like you sort of put it in text, maybe, I think, right? And you're like also having to explain it to your dad.
Yeah.
Like in the re-recording sort of scenario. And I guess back to your earlier comment about how he was just not interested in your process or your filmmaking, or like the fact that you're even shooting this, really. He's just on the trip with you. But like, even in that re-recording, he's like, "Oh, what happened? You were shooting a movie? What?"
Yeah,
like,
he sort of has this like, there's that stupid camera you kept shoving in my face, like, and you kept like you wouldn't let me walk around, like there was, so there's a whole component there of those, I think how can I put it? In some ways, for me, I think it allows for a bit of comedy in what otherwise becomes a more serious discussion later on, because he is by his nature a sort of someone that doesn't necessarily take things seriously, and so having to do that reenactment, it allowed him to kind of poke fun at the entire thing, or to like provide himself with distance from what like actually occurred. And so that to me found seemed to be like an important part for him, in order to be able to sort of find a new form of comfort with the fact that it was happening, because he could distance himself by joking about it, or by kind of like questioning it in the aftermath. Yeah.
I just want to make sure we have time in case anyone wants to ask folks questions or comments, and obviously you can ask each other questions about your projects. But so before I keep it rolling. Toma will deliver a microphone to you if you would like to share something. No. Okay.
Can I ask something?
Yes, you can.
I'm curious to which degree, because we've been talking about these strategies for interrogation or strategies for relationship building while working on these films. to what extent would you do things differently if you did them again? Or where did you feel that this strategy might have had limitations or pitfalls that you may not be 100% content with?
Thank you for that question. I think if I were to be bold, I would have maybe leave the whole thing black. But then that's like, I think that's that question, like, what is a film without image? And I love actually coming across this essay on like the Open City journal. There was this whole like a series of beautiful writings about like cinema like against the light and cinema for the shadows. So I think that's something I want to keep wrestle with, and to like question like what is a film viewing experience, or like film feeling sensing experience, and like I was questioned like, well, what's the intention of these images? And it's like it's not something I could just like really explained with language. Like I feel it's something subconscious happening with when I capture these things. I just see and I like how this cloud looks like, and I don't know, I want to understand, but I think I think it's also interesting how we learn to talk about our choices, and I don't know, I don't fully trust what I really like know. Like there's a lot of multiple truth.
I was just going to say, it made me, when you said, oh, maybe I should have left it black, makes me think of Derek Jarman's Blue. Yeah, it's bold. And then I was also going to say something else that I already forgot in response. Oh, well, I guess it made me actually think of the dance parts in your film, right? Like the idea of what trying to express something without using language, I guess, in a documentary context, especially. Do you want to talk about I'm curious about how the dance sections came about.
Yeah, well, I used to be a dancer. So during the pandemic, I had this like urge to dance again. I hadn't done it since I was about 14 or 15. And it was great to like return to it, like going to the dance shop again and finding the right like shade of tights. It was nice. But essentially like to choreograph, since I hadn't done it in so long, I was like, okay, I have to get my body into like the movement. So the Dance Theater of Harlem had these like pandemic modern dance classes that they would just put up on YouTube. So I would just do those classes, and then afterwards I would film myself freestyling, and then I would watch it, and if I liked a move, like I would kind of just put it together that way. But actually, if there was anything that I would have done differently, I would have left more time for the dances. We shot it in one day in this vineyard in LA, and it was even getting the vineyard. It's like right near, my DP is here, and it's like right near his house. And so getting the location was kind of like frantic. And so I didn't plan enough time, honestly. So I probably would have done that differently, because I ended up only having really 11 or 12 minutes of usable footage for the film, which it worked out. But yeah, I think the dancers were really troopers, because we were dancing in the middle of these like rows of trees, and we all just had to sort of adapt. And it did turn out wonderful. But yeah, I think the mistakes or the glitches or anything that like didn't go right ended up like, I remember in art class, they would say like, there are no mistakes in art. You can always make it at something else. And like, that was definitely the process for the dance pieces.
So when you were choreographing the dance, were you also thinking about the questions or specific questions?
I was thinking about the sections. So I had come up with the chapters pretty early on. But even then it completely shifted. So I choreographed certain pieces to be within certain chapters. But then when I was in the editing booth, like it became really intuitive, and it was like, this section belongs here, and yeah, so it didn't really matter in the end. But yeah.
To go back to Toma's question, does anyone else want to or have thoughts about what you might do differently?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't have even finished the film when I did. I don't think, because I don't think I would have also gone back and done anything differently, just because the filmmaking process was a self-therapeutic process. It was my way of working through a lot of things that I don't think would be clinically advised by anyone, and maybe did more harm in some places than they helped. But I was forced to complete it by school. And I think one of the weaknesses of it is that because I wasn't thinking necessarily when I was making it about making a cohesive piece, I wasn't really thinking about a final product. And so whenever I was filming, the way that I would engage was just the processing that I had done up to that point. And I think for it to have gone further as a film, for it maybe to have been a longer piece, for it to have transcended itself, I needed to think more about it as a film and anticipate in that way. But I just wasn't, and that was a symptom of what making the film meant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And also maybe goes back to Jalou was saying about like just the act of collecting, right? And like sometimes we do that for a really long time before making the thing or whatever, unless you're rushed into it, you know. But your timing too of shooting, like during that the fire, it was the one from the baby gender reveal party or whatever.
So the fire that's featured in the film was the gender reveal party fire, as it's called, that was in the San Bernardino mountains, which becomes a motif, a strange motif. Yeah.
I actually really love that macro and micro sort of structure from like these sweeping landscapes of huge plumes of smoke, like into these incredibly claustrophobic, like the moles and freckles and wrinkles on your father's skin. Like I think that, so the timing of being there and shooting during that, I feel like was fortuitous. And I love the way that you assemble those things together.
Thank you. Yeah, it was very much a film about the present moment, and micro and macro, zooming in and out. Also, Eileen, I watched your film this morning, and it was, for me, it was trying to access the microscopic, was trying to access something primordial that I couldn't necessarily capture in the landscape or by being at a normal distance from anything. Yeah.
Just finish with one quick thought about what I would have done differently. The making of my film was very therapeutic for me too, with the grief of losing my grandma, and for my whole family as well. But I wish I would have done more interviews with her, you know, and sat down with a audio recorder or just whatever. More often, it seemed like always there was going to be a next time, you know, and time is finite, and that's what makes life beautiful. But I'm glad I have this one. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Nick has a question.
Yeah, this is kind of a big abstract thing. I'll do my best to put it into a concise. Hopefully, it'll end up being a question. So, like the grand topic of the moment in the realm of documentary is like representation and who has the right to tell what story, and is it, you know, is the story that ends up coming out justified from the point of view of whose story you're telling, things like this. So the idea is like, obviously, are you from this community or whatever? When you're making a film about your family member, and I think like most of you who have made films about your family member on this panel, we made a film about her great aunt who's in her 90s. There's this sense that like yeah, they're allowing you to make this film, but they don't quite understand why you're doing it, and and the style in which many of us are making films is something that is probably alien to many of our family members, especially ones of older generations. And it's like if you is the consent, where does like the access and consent lie in that situation when they really don't understand what it is that you're doing? Does that make sense? And if it's not like if it's not something that they comprehend, but they're of your own family, and that is like as deep into a community as you can get in many situations, it's your own family. It's like, where is that bar? You know? Does that make sense?
Yeah, does anyone want to? Let's ask Kim or John first, if either of you wants to answer that, so that we don't lose track of you.
Yeah, I mean, so this film that's in the festival is with my partner, but before that, I had made films about using home movie footage, and 2 films about my mom. And my family doesn't know that they exist. And if my mom did, she would be infuriated because my version is much different than her version. I feel like with my family in particular, I really cannot care less because I feel like I'm so angry about my childhood still. I'm just like in this place of I'm not happy about what happened, and I've done so much trauma work about it, and I'm still just not there yet. So I just feel like that's my story, and it's mine because I went through it, and they don't really have a right to say anything about what I make. And if things had been different, then I wouldn't have to tell those stories, basically. So yeah, I just feel like specifically in regards to my family and the toxicity and the trauma around it, I'm just not even in a place to consider what they would feel or think about it. And I don't, yeah, that's probably really unethical, but I'm still like, yeah, it's my story. And so, yeah, and I think with my partner, I mean, because I love them and have a very different relationship with them than I do with my family of origin, like, I did really care. They had never seen or been exposed to experimental film before dating me. And I think that they were really confused when I was showing them drafts. And it really meant a lot to me that they approved of it and that they liked it. But they were really confused and would like give me feedback. Like, I just don't think it makes any sense. I don't think it honors the story that I told. Like, I just don't get it. And then like last fall, we like went to an experimental film festival. I like had them come with me. And then after we like left one of the first programs, they were like, okay, so your film is actually narrative compared to what we just saw. And I was like, okay, so you get it a little bit more, like, so I think like after they were kind of like exposed a little bit more to like the culture of experimental filmmaking, they actually like it kind of opened their mind a little bit, and they were kind of like, okay, like I actually see your work in a new light now that I have a little bit of a basis for understanding how stories are told in your world. But yeah, I mean, I did actually like draft like a consent form for them to sign. That was kind of like, it was like the first 2 months of dating. I'm like, can you sign this consent form? That was like, you know, I give my rights to Kim, you know, to like use my body and my image and my story and my voice, and like, and she's gonna submit it to film festivals, and like, you know, like I consent to all of it, and I still have it. Like they never signed it. So yeah, like I just moved and I just found like that thing, and I told them, I was like, I still want you to sign this. You know, it's like 2 years later. I'm like, I'm still waiting for you to sign this document saying you consent to the process. So yeah, I guess I hope that we don't break up, and then I guess I hope if we do break up, they don't sue me. But yeah, no, it's I guess I trust their integrity about it.
I would just say, you know, my film I'm showing here is not about family, but I think still that question of not fully understanding what it might mean to consent to a film is, I think that surfaces a lot in documentary, even not about family. And there's, you know, one moment where someone might agree to be filmed, but then that filming process is ongoing and viewed in different ways at different times too. So I guess just to keep it short, but I think like ongoing conversations about what it means to be filmed and about the filming process, and kind of keeping that door open to continued conversations throughout the filming process is something that I found value in, especially in a story where I shared some identities with the central participant in the film, but certainly not all identities. So yeah.
Thanks, John. Especially for yours too, since like you were saying, the meaning changed so drastically from what you and Emily had first set out to be making. What about the rest of you?
I mean, yeah, just kind of, hello? Yeah. Just because exactly, it is sort of a family member, and it's kind of a difficult thing. Like you're talking about, their either disinterest or kind of lack of understanding of it, of the process. And I guess there's kind of a two-edged component to that, where I think sometimes as a person producing films, or as a person that's like very concerned about ideas around documentary, sometimes you end up really fretting around these issues of representation. And when you try and discuss them even with your subjects, they seem totally irrelevant to them. Like they don't feel the same kind of sensitivity that maybe you feel about it, or the same worry. Like they just go, well, it's a video. I didn't do anything illegal. It's a video. It's, you know, like there's kind of this thought about the level of impact in their mind as to what it is. And specifically for me, in relationship to family, it almost becomes in a funny way, kind of like an exchange of labor, wherein it's participating in the documentary was in some ways like could be repaid in a way by, you know, helping to install a window or to mend a fence, or like that there is this actual kind of like quid pro quo. You know, I gave you an hour and a half of voice work, you come and you have to like mow my lawn for 2 weeks. And so it just became this kind of like exchange in that way that was, you know, he viewed it as like, okay, well, you know, we're just doing work for each other. Like you have your thing that you care about. Like I want, you know, XYZ done. Like, okay, we'll just do a trade. And so I know that's not the way it is necessarily all the time, but that was kind of the way that the I guess the bargaining sort of shook out there, wherein it became, yeah, just an idea of really like trading your time for my time, and we'll spend my time doing something you want, and you spend your time doing something I want. So
yeah, like expanding on that too. There actually this film called Shared Resources. I wonder if people, it's by this filmmaker Jordan Lord. There was a really amazing scene where the filmmaker sits the mother and the father down to sign the media release, but he made the media release in his own language, and he pretty much like chose like the opposite words of what it like a binding media release is. And his father refused to sign it because of they are in this life, like they are bound by their relationship. They are, like it's this understanding of they're indebted to each other. There's no contract would bind our relationship. We are in relation, So I think it's a really great question about like how we are in relation, and also this right for self-expression and voice, like what Kim is saying. Like I think that, I mean, there's like in literature too, like there are writers who would write in one language and they don't translate it into this other language, and for protection, for whatever. And really feel that desire for voice and expression. And I think it just becomes more like when we enter into that system, the ecosystem, how these things are entangled. And I mean, for my grandpa, like I don't, we don't even have consent as a shared value in American culture. But I think we practice consent in our own understanding. So there is a lot of, I think language and translation and what that means in this part of the world.
Thanks, everyone. I'm not sure if this is going to come across as like a question or a comment so much, but thinking on all of these answers and also on your question, Nicholas, I can't help but wonder if like making a very personal film about family also is kind of I've done it as well, is also kind of a reminder that the filmic medium is also very much about not knowing and just being able to think on something and not go beyond it. There's kind of a reminder of our limitations, of our understanding of loved ones happening. And it's interesting because it happens on such a small, intimate scale in a personal work. But I think on kind of bigger and like more very politically charged work where it also appears, like Patricio Guzman, the Chilean filmmaker, in This Is the Way I Like It Too. I'm kind of giving it away, but everybody should watch it anyway. It ends with him and his editor having this argument about what film is. That's the question he's been asking this whole time. And it's also about what film is in a moment of political repression of the dictatorship in Chile in the 80s. And they're like arguing about it and like, movement, perception, intuition, understanding. And they are like cold, getting closer. And then finally it ends on thinking. And they say, okay, well, that's pretty close. So maybe sometimes thinking about a loved one through the medium is like as close as we can get. And thank you, because I feel like you've all like reminded us of this important, kind of difficult thing to realize about filmmaking, that it doesn't necessarily lead to some revelation, some understanding. Okay, it was more of a comment, I guess.
Thank you.
My bad.
That also makes me think about this documentary editor, Karen Perlman. We had one of her works in the festival last year, but she writes about editing as a process of distributed cognition, which I think is also like applicable to other phases of making a documentary too, but of thinking through the images, like of, taking your the process extends out. And it's not just happening in our minds, obviously. But I think that's really, really relevant, especially to the way a lot of us, again, like collect images. We end up with this mixed bag of stuff, and then we're trying to make a cohesive sentence out of these, sometimes random feeling words. I think we're pretty much out of time, unless there's any last questions or comments out there or up here for each other. Or on there, yes, of course. Up there. Okay, great. Thanks everybody so much for talking about your work and your practice. And I hope everybody gets to watch each other's work over the next few days. So most folks here are either in the program Birthmarks, or Kim's work is in an acute presence, which I think is on Sunday. And John and Brody are both in the program tomorrow night at 8. So please, what? Oh yeah, Saturday night, sorry. And then Alma's work will be on view at the Documentary Arts venue on campus later today. So check out each other's work, and thank you so much for participating in the festival. And thank you, Kim and John, for joining us virtually. Really appreciate it. Bye.
Thanks.